I would like to call the March 21st, 2024 meeting of the Land Use Advisory Committee to order. I'm assuming there's no concerns about the agenda, so the agenda is approved as written. We need approval of the February 22nd, 2024 Land Use Advisory Committee special meeting minutes.
Motion to approve.
Second.
Any discussion? Seeing none, all in favor say aye.
Aye.
Opposed say nay. We're good on the minutes. Okay. We have two information items. The first one is scenario plan consolidated findings.
Should I go?
You can go.
All right. Hello, I see some familiar faces. I hope you remember me.
Oh, yeah.
I've been around for a while. Well, I'm Baris. Dawes. I'm a planning analyst at the Community Development Division, and I've been talking to you about scenario planning for quite a while now, and this is the sort of the wrapping of the study and the findings. So I wanted to talk primarily about the policy connections to the consolidated findings that we have. And so far I've been talking about this stuff by looking at our current policies, but today I'm going to sort of pivot a little bit toward the future policy in Imagine 2050. So today's presentation, as I said, I'm going to bring the scenario findings together and look at them in a more holistic way. And I think you have an accompanying memo that you should have with the findings in detail. So I will have a sort of a higher level summary of the findings and just leave you with the details. But I'm more than happy to take questions after my talk. Basically, I'm hoping that by summarizing these findings, we'll draw some lessons about the policy piece and go into further policy discussion. So some of these slides, there's one coming up. I know Chair Wolf is not going to be happy, but I'll keep it short. You've seen it too many times. So I have a couple of slides that are very brief reminders since you've seen it a while ago. And we have done this presentation with the Regional Development Guide Working Group, which is a council committee, a small work group basically. And I have changed some of the slides based on their recommendations. So since you've last seen them, some of the slides are different. So why are we doing scenario planning? It's mostly for planning for the future and making sure that we're ready for it. We have no idea where we're going to go. And it could be something like A, B, C, D. These are all extreme cases, but we are hoping to plan for that oval in the cone. It's sort of a range of options. It's not just the four quadrants and the business as usual, but anything that falls in between is really the range is what we're planning for. And we're not really going after an ideal scenario. It's going to be just looking at overall, what are we doing? Are we ready for anything that comes up? This is your favorite slide. So I want to talk about a couple of aspects of this. I'm not going to go through the details of the actual scenarios. You've heard them a few times at this point. One of the pieces that I want to emphasize is we keep talking about these scenarios as regional growth scenarios. These are actually locational preferences. So in effect, they come from real estate models where we look at market demand. So wherever development is happening, that's what these scenarios are exploring. So it's a different way of looking at it. We talk a lot about regional growth because we look at it from a forecast point of view. But in effect, they're real estate markets, and these are different market scenarios in some ways. And so if you think about it, most city planners and urban regional planners, we just care about where the market develops. It's an uncertainty. So this is a great opportunity to think about that particular piece, basically. And I just want to remind you that these examples that we chose, they are extreme examples, but they're reasonable. They're based on our existing plans. And they are also realistic in the sense that the growth conditions that we experience in here has been experienced in the past. So they're plausible, basically. And one other piece that I would like to remind you is that when we simulated these compact versus dispersed scenarios, we actually used the density ranges that are already embedded in the existing comp plans. So for the compact scenarios, we use the high density, high end of the density spectrum in the comp plans, and for the dispersed ones, we use the lower end. So these are all within the universe of existing plans, basically. Another piece that I want to talk about that this kept coming up in our conversations is the difference. When I talk about compactness versus dispersion, we talk about there is a growth element to it and a development element to it. And when we talk about growth, we're really referring to regional distribution of growth of population and employment. Whereas when we talk about development, that's the growth that's happening within a community, and also the built form of that particular growth. So when I talk about built form, I mean density, I mean the location of the development in relation to existing infrastructure, the size of the footprint, whether or not it's contiguous and connected to other developments, and finally, if it encourages alternate modes of travel, basically. So in terms of growth, I want to remind you that under all growth types that we analyze, there is growth across the region. So you can have compact growth, but your suburban and rural areas are still taking in quite a bit of growth. It's just the proportions are different. And the growth piece is that in terms of guiding growth, that primarily falls under the jurisdiction or the role is taken by the council. But when you look at development, the guiding development is primarily the role of cities and townships. So I want to kind of come back to this slide, and you have seen this slide before, but I want to quickly walk through so that we can talk about where we are in the process. As I mentioned before, the scenario analysis had two different phases. It's the analysis phase and then the policy phase. And we hope that the analysis phase basically informs the policy phase. And during the analysis, we asked 3 questions. The first one was, how might the region's growth vary? And we looked at the 5 different scenarios just to see what they might look like. We simulated those. And then we asked, how would these futures impact the region? So we basically analyzed the impact of these futures on our systems and on the region, trying to figure out how that future would look different, basically. And finally, we looked at those impacts and tried to align them with our vision. And what that means is basically the council has 5 regional goals, and we tried to figure out how would these futures impact those goals, and would they make it easier for us to reach those regional goals, or would they make it harder? So that comparison kind of gives us a basis to talk about the policy phase. What kind of policies we can put in place so that we can realize our goals under different circumstances, hopefully under all of them. So currently in this slide, we're on the red arrow, and we're hoping that by looking at the findings of the answers to the 3rd question, we should be able to give some high-level policy guidance that could be used by our policy writers as they keep on drafting them. So, so far I've discussed the first and the second questions. The 3rd one, you've heard about it, but the findings you haven't heard so far. And the memo includes the detailed findings, but I will go back to the relationship between the 2nd and the 3rd columns and talk a little bit about that. So the alignments that we did, we tried to establish between the regional goals and the findings basically looked at individual findings that we had, and we tried to link them to specific regional goals. As an example, I'll just use the land use alignments with the regional goals. There were two land use findings that I presented to you a while back. The first one is the one about compact scenarios. In those scenarios, we do use land more effectively and efficiently, and because of that, the footprint of development is a lot smaller. And this is the case regardless of how much the region grows, basically. And the second finding we found in the land use area was that in compact scenarios, there is less pressure on agricultural development or on the region's agricultural areas and natural systems. So what does that mean in terms of our goals? One of the goals that the council has is protecting the natural systems in the region. And in the case of compact scenarios, it is easier for us to protect the region's natural systems because the footprint is smaller. And in terms of the ag areas, in compact scenarios, it is easier for us to keep the economy more dynamic and resilient because we're not encroaching upon the agricultural sector, which is an important part of the region's economy. So overall, we went through every single finding and matched them up with the regional goals that we have and established all the connections. So we can just take a look at, this time in a cumulative fashion, how do these futures fare in terms of making our lives easier or harder in terms of our regional goals. And we found that in the compact scenarios, there are a lot of alignments between the findings and the goals. And in the dispersed scenarios, we found that there were some, but overall, compared to compact scenarios, there were fewer opportunities for reaching our goals in an easy fashion. So overall, compact scenarios seem to make our lives easier in terms of meeting the regional goals. So the main takeaways of this presentation really is that we have two. As I mentioned, regional goals overall are easier to achieve in compact scenarios, and that we face more challenges to achieving our goals in dispersed scenarios. Those are the two main findings. So what do we do with these findings? I think the goal at this point is we have done the analysis. Now it's time for policymakers to look at things and see how they would like to respond to it. And there are three questions that are at the core of this policy making phase. And these are not questions for you to answer, I should just say. It's just the conceptual underlining of it, basically. And so the main questions are, how are we going to guide growth, basically? If we want to achieve our goals under every circumstance or under each future, how do we guide growth? And then we ask whether there are robust policies that could help us under each future, because that's the low-hanging fruit. If you could do something and it just is useful under each scenario, that's a really good case. And the other question is, how could it work for different kinds of communities? Because it's not a one-size-fits-all. And some of these compact strategies or policies that encourage compactness might not work as well in certain areas, and the policies should be responsive to that as well. So based on these main findings, we have recommended two high-level policy guidance. And as you will see, these two principles or the two points of guidance are really an expression of the robust policies. We do indeed have robust policies. And compactness, guiding the region toward compactness in terms of both growth and development is that robust policy. And so when we do guide the region toward compact growth and development, we're actually moving it closer to our regional goals. And in cases where we have dispersed development. In those cases, we can still move the region toward our goals if we choose compact development strategies, and this does not fall on the council, but it's a collaboration between cities and the council. And these particular types of policies could actually mitigate some of the challenges we observe in dispersed scenarios. I just want to give a few examples of these sort of policy expressions of these of the high policy guidelines that I was talking about. One example is from the land use arena, and our LPA colleagues came here and talked to you about the proposed density policy, some of the concepts. And I don't need to read or repeat them, but you are familiar with it at this point. But all of these density concepts that they have introduced, they are poised to promote compact growth, basically. Another example comes from housing. And so when we looked at growth scenarios, we just realized that there are sometimes unintended consequences of different types of growth. And growth could lead to displacement of low-income residents more than any other, in most cases, or it could lead to it. And so any housing policies that we have within our housing policy plan should be attentive to this particular issue. And I just pulled out two different approaches, building affordable housing where displacement risk is highest, and preserving naturally occurring affordable housing. Those are policies that you would see in our housing policy plan, and they're meant to address mitigate some of the misalignments that scenarios bring about. And then the last policy example I have is, it pertains to aligning land use and transportation. And in this case, I focused on compact development and transit because it's the alignment between those two approaches could actually make transit more financially viable, especially in suburban areas where it's not necessarily viable. Bringing together transit with compact development really allows the region to serve more of our region's residents. And so in that sense, we could think of in terms of potential policy responses, we can think of encouraging compact and connected development around transit station areas. That would be one way of aligning land use with transportation. And then in terms of transportation policies, we would invest in transit in ways that would connect activity centers. So that's really the end of my presentation, and I want to open the floor for your discussion. What do you think of this high-level policy guidance that was suggested by the findings? And just want to get a sense of what you think.
Who wants to go first?
Could I?
Sure.
Baris, I just wonder if you could, you talked about compact development quite a bit. If you can define what compact and the scope of scenario planning means. My understanding is that where there is existing infrastructure, where there is existing development, whether it is in Belle Plaine, whether it is in Stillwater or the urban core, compact development patterns happen, and that's my understanding.
Yeah.
So I just wanted to clarify that. We had some conversation about that at CDC on Monday too, so I just wanted to make sure we were all kind of understanding that before the discussion.
Yeah, I would
That was
say.
actually going to be my question.
I think that you can have a situation where you have dispersed scenarios, but you can respond to them by doing compact development. So if you're growing in a suburban area, you can still grow in a compact fashion. All it takes is, the build form looks different. You're not going to look like Minneapolis, but it would be more compact than dispersed. That is within the realm of cities to decide.
I'd just say yes, thank you, Madam Chair. Compact development, I see it in the neighborhood I live in, which is new development, Amber Field, but you have to define that for the cities. And the developer community is doing that because of cost. So we're seeing a left and right. But when you tie it to transit, especially when you show light rail on here, that's only going to occur in the urban core. It will not occur in the suburbs because of the cost and 10 years to build a line or whatever. You just don't see that. Now, if you put a bus up there, I'd say, well, we could probably make that work. But it's a chicken and egg, and we're so difficult to get transit in this region at it. I'd say cost is the thing, and I'd sort of try to figure that policy component out a little more, and what is the message you'll communicate to the cities? Because I think there'd be strong distrust, especially in this third ring.
That was kind of what I was going to get at a little bit too, was that in my mind, when we talk about compactness and transit as kind of a way to envision that, is that even farther out, you'll have sort of at the end of the line, you might have a park and ride or something like that. And where a community is struggling to get their 3 units per acre because they want 1 acre lots or whatever, that's a place where you can say, hey, this is an area where it makes sense to have more intensity of development, more density, because that's more walkable to the transit, even though it's a park and ride, and theoretically it's still built around cars. But in a community where there's just not a lot of density or intensity, that would be a way to try to guide towards compactness, like you're saying, in an area that's still fairly spread out otherwise. So I can see where there is that nexus there.
Well, we've been doing that up to now, except the pandemic sort of turned everything on its head, and park and rides are just not what they used to be. Some of them are coming back.
Well, they need to be walking rides, maybe. The other thing I would note too is that I think the pressure of compact development is different, like you were saying, in different communities. Certainly in Minneapolis and St. Paul and the core cities, you can't get much more compact than you already are. And so I think the question is, I think which gets to what Phil talked before the meeting, is do you start taxing the infrastructure by trying to even pack more people in to a given area? I think the challenge for us as sort of a first or second ring suburb is the tension between more density and the people that still live there from the 50s who remember when there were farm fields, and and there's that conflict is there. And then obviously for the farther out, we just talked about how do you get that compactness in an area where there is such a spread out pattern already. So yeah.
Madam Chair.
Go.
Thank you. Yeah, that's one of the things that, thank you for saying that, Dan. One of the things that I was looking at is, that we want the compacted, we want to have people compacted in. The issue becomes, as far as affordability, if we take the current situation right now, if we wanted affordable housing and we want it to be developed, why is it not being developed? I mean, you'd think that it'd be more cost effective. Well, we can build a townhome. Townhomes are not being built right now because they have to put up with homeowners association and all the rest of that stuff, versus on let's say a couple acres of land where they can put a home that's worth $500,000 to $700,000 plus and put one home on it and it's done. It's a cost relationship, and it's like what Bill was mentioning before. I think it's just how much is this thing going to cost us. I think the market's going to determine how things are going to get developed, and we can have policies in place. And I think they should be as goals, and I think that's what that we're reaching for. But to mandate or to put anything that any type of mandate in place in a policy would be detrimental and push back, especially with affordability. And the other thing too is, as I was reading in California, they had put up affordable housing funds that build affordable housing, but they put so much restrictions on the monies that were supposed to go to affordable housing. No contractor or developer picked it up. They just left it sit there. So nothing was built. So that's one thing we need to be cognizant of.
Currently, we have a bunch of new money that's coming into the pipeline for affordable housing going to the cities and counties. It doesn't have a lot of rules on it, but the like the CDAs and the people that are gonna be administering this money are watching very carefully to see when they start tightening up different parts of it and making it hard to have the flexibility. They expect that will happen at some point, because that's just the nature of government, but
It is.
currently it's, it's pretty flexible money.
It has been, yes, and we've seen that in our city of Hugo. We've had those monies come through the CDA at Washington County, and that worked out.
But the new money that's coming in, we've never seen this in our lifetime. And I will just use Dakota County, so the half cent at the county and a quarter at the city.
Yeah.
We at the county, it's 7, 8, 9 million as it ramps up this year and out. And then with the cities, it would be 14, 15 million of new money annual.
Mhm.
So how you leverage that, never before have we had that amount of money without strings, but how you work with those monies going forward. Now, hopefully, cities and counties work together.
Yeah.
And you have good results 5 and 10 years down the road. But independently, some cities might not want to and do it on their own, but this is, in my view, once in a lifetime with the legislation last year.
I guess if I may.
Sure.
The other thing is too, is a question is if we do put funds out there for quote affordable housing, then what's the incentive for developers to lower their price as far as building?
Well,
Other than they get the tax, they get the rebates and so forth.
no, but the CDA director from Dakota County was talking to me about when they fund things, they look at the budget that the contractor has, and if it's too padded, they say no till you get your costs down. They do that now, and they will continue to do that
So
with
there is
the
a
new
review
money.
that's.
We've turned
Oh,
down a
of
project
course.
on that basis.
Yeah.
Okay,
Yeah.
okay, all right.
It was a TIF request in our case, but it was the same thing, it didn't work.
That's okay, that's good.
It seems like there's a lot of different, it's very situational in different parts of the region. I mean, like, Wayzata has gone insane. If you've gone to right along the lake in Wayzata, it's, the development there is just crazy. Traffic is crazy too. Because there's a huge demand to be there. Other parts of the region, maybe not so much. And like you said, no townhouses, but Farmington and Lakeville and Rosemount are doing townhouses.
Left and right.
Yeah, and they're expensive.
Yes,
I think that's the challenge.
Yeah.
That's a challenge, yes. Yes.
Go ahead, Kathy.
I think that the other things that, I was kind of writing down too, is we talked about the incentivizing some of these programs, because I think that is part of it. And now you just stated that there's going to be money set aside. But I think when it comes to transportation, the side that I see that is the barriers is the safety and the destination. Because when we're in Shakopee, a lot of our transit goes downtown. It's not going to Edina, it's not going to Minnetonka, it's where people are working. So it's a really kind of one-sided, ride. And so the people who maybe would use a park and ride and go to Edina or to, another suburb, they're having to go all the way downtown to catch something back. So it just seems like that destination piece is something that we have to address as well when we think about transit.
To some degree, microtransit is dealing with that, because isn't Southwest Prime serving Shakopee?
We have some of it, but not a lot that comes in. There was, and then there was a line that they tried to put through 494, but again, COVID happened, so that all stopped.
Nobody wrote it.
And so there's ways and times that they tried to address it, but it just didn't get traction.
Well, the one to Mall of America still goes.
Yes, yeah.
And hopefully, I'll get you. And hopefully, MBTA will consider expanding their microtransit to the east. They have good coverage in the west part of their, well, in the center, not so much in Rosemount, probably.
Well, they have Connect,
Yeah.
so you can dial a ride.
Yeah, we have some of that, but then there's also the manning of the rides, because I've heard from our county commissioner that there's a lot of times they don't have the people to do the dial rides,
That
to
is-
do the actual
That's a
transit.
challenge for
And
everybody.
if Uber and Lyft goes away, you won't have any.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah,
Well, we might have a lot
Might
more
be a
people
job.
that are willing to be a driver, so.
You know,
Go ahead,
one
Bill.
thing, if I may add on, I always think that suburban communities that would partner with other next door neighbors and build clusters together. We have a heck of a lot of cities all over this whole metro. But if you would work together and cluster, you could build the inner relationship that you could put in. Circulator routes every hour because you all work together. But if you do it individually, it's hard to build enough cluster to make that happen.
Yeah.
So figure out how to put that in policy.
I'll mention it.
And you get bonus something.
One thing you didn't talk about is the impact of restricting land supply on land prices. You know, if we are trying to push for not expanding the MUSA, that the price goes up, and you end up driving some people out to Delano or Otsego or other places outside of the 7-county metro area because they're gonna go where they can afford what they want.
I'm gonna claim ignorance because I'm not a planner, but I have, as a sort of an economist, talking to our forecaster, he tells me that there's plenty of land to grow over the next 3 decades or so within the MUSA. So I don't think we are like Portland where MUSA is setting up pressure on land prices necessarily.
I don't think it's that bad. I wasn't implying that it was that bad, but not all of those sellers are willing sellers either.
Yes.
Well, I would also add that for us, the tribe is buying up a lot of land.
Yeah.
And so that pushes development out further because that ends up in trust for 100 years and then it develops around it.
Yeah, there's a lot of holes in Shakopee because of the trust lands for the tribe.
Yeah.
Noah, you're being really quiet. You got anything to say?
I guess I was kind of curious, like, yeah, which communities might push back on the requirement to, or the exclusion from MUSA in terms of future development. Like, is that something that we anticipate, or is it not a huge issue?
Yeah, I think so. Chair and committee members, we aren't talking about pulling any community out of the MUSA that's already in the MUSA.
Sure.
We're just talking about holding the MUSA where it is, and in fact, in the last planning cycle, we also didn't expand the MUSA. And so the land supply within that, the communities that have already planned for development within the MUSA and the infrastructure that goes along with that will still be within the MUSA. And so the communities that are currently not within the MUSA and those on the developing edge where maybe part of their community is in and part of their community is out will be impacted, but we're not talking about not allowing MUSA expansions at all. We're just talking about identifying some criteria beyond simple wastewater capacity that might make any expansions more planful, more consistent as to why and when and where we're expanding MUSA. It would, for a new community to come into the MUSA, we have some existing policies like 1,000 acres, if you've never been served. So some of those things will still be unchanged, but really just talking about making it a little bit more planful and consistent with how we are extending the MUSA when and if we need to. And I shouldn't say we, the council, not me.
I thought
That's
we were
helpful.
already doing that. Actually, I was the one who said, let's keep the MUSA where it is 10 years ago. I'm a little more worried about it now for the effect on property values. Go
I
ahead.
did want to note too, I was glad you mentioned about the potential for protecting natural areas with compactness, because I think that can help balance some of those competing points of view. If you can say, yes, you can get a little more intensity perhaps around your park/walk and ride area, but you can protect this sort of natural area to serve for stormwater purposes or recreational purposes or all of the above. I think those are things that people look at more and more. And so I think that's beneficial to have that as part of the policy discussions as well, and maybe as part of the sales pitch to help promote the policies.
Well, there is the challenge of the urban parks being loved to death too. They're under a lot of pressure from from high use. Phil?
Yes, we talked about this before the meeting, but another thing would be is, as far as government regulations, as far as setbacks and other things around different types of, like streams or lakes or whatever, that should be probably considered also as well, in my opinion. That maybe add some restrictions to the ability to do more condensed housing, possibly. I don't know.
There are times when DNR rules make it really, really hard to
Make it
do
extremely
compact
difficult.
development. Because there was a commercial parcel in Lakeville on Orchard Lake or Kingsley Lake, I can't remember which. And it was zoned so it could be a McDonald's and you could put a big parking lot right up, close to the lake. And they wanted to do an old folks home instead.
Yeah.
And DNR spent 10 years saying, no, you can't do that. And then they finally worked it out and the old folks home is there. And it's set way back from the lake because they wanted to keep all of those trees, as a nice amenity and just concentrate people towards the road as much as possible.
Yeah.
But it took a lot of patience and willingness on the property owner's part to keep fighting with the DNR in order to get that done. So sometimes our state agencies work against each other.
And Madam Chair, we just went through that in the city of Hugo, our city owns some property that's against the Egg Lake. And the developer came in and granted was pushing the boundaries on the high water mark. But anyways, we spent almost 8-10 years on it. He finally just pulled the plug on and said, I'm done, I walked away. So that is a problem.
I think that helps. That's the thing where the cities or whoever's kind of setting up comp plan guidance and zoning and all that stuff needs to be especially aware of some of those restrictions as you go into that process. So hopefully you can try to guide things in a way that isn't in conflict necessarily.
Right.
I mean, obviously, the 1959 zoning code in the city of Roseville doesn't comply with the current DNR standards, so that's a whole other thing. But I mean, but as we plan forward, I think as I've been doing this, I've definitely learned that it helps to make sure we're thinking about all the different agencies, entities, and who's involved in all this and what their requirements are, because it does help you to kind of refocus how you plan things as the city that's responsible.
Be proactive.
But you also need to be able to react to changes in demand, because I mean, that parcel was commercial in like the 80s.
Yeah.
And never developed, and so they adapted to what the need was, because we've got a lot more old people. And we've got to have the flexibility.
That's
to
why
do
almost
that.
every district in our zoning code right now is called mixed use.
Yes,
So
I
we
was
can
gonna
do
say,
almost anything anywhere
Yeah,
with
yeah,
variations
that's-
across
yeah.
the city.
That's been very helpful in not having to come back to us.
yes, yes.
One other comment, and being around for 20 years, I understand the rural component and people don't want to sell, but I've seen it in a 20-year period, and I'll use McMenemy as a family in Rosemount for 30 years. They weren't going to develop, they sued each other. And then they're demanding that we put it in a nuisance so they could develop because land prices be up and down. And realize this is 2050. We're sitting here at 2024. You don't know what you don't know and value, but long term to our 7-county metro, when you're saying planners, there's plenty of land. In the 7-county metro, that's where we have the infrastructure. Yes, it might not develop for 20 years, but in 21 years it may. And then, it's more cost effective for this, otherwise you're plowing up Northfield or whatever. And that's hard to communicate to a family that says absolutely never until they passed away. Oh yeah, we wanted that.
Well, a lot of times now that it's when somebody dies, then the kids sell the property, but
Correct.
not always. Mrs. Anderson's goat farm on Ipava just will not go away.
Or the farm in Bloomington on the river, they're never
Yeah.
still there.
Yeah.
Any other thoughts anybody wants to share? I guess to me, ultimately, it depends on what people want more than what we want. We have to put the choices out there, and if we are able to give them attractive choices that are compact and they take them, great. If they want something you know, a single family home on a typical suburban lot, we still need to offer that as an option for people too, because if we don't have choices, people won't come here.
Yes.
Well, I'd just add that cluster component. It's how you define it will clearly impact how new development occurs out in Third Ring. So to have a good definition example, so planners might have a better understanding than elected, I'll say. And it's just so important to explain it at the elected level.
Okay.
Madam Chair, just a quick question.
Sure.
To your point, I think, Bill, do we have any templates for like a circulator that serves, you know, 3 or 4 suburban communities versus like even from around the country? Because I mean, I love that idea, and I think it would have legs even for creating, you know, more robust kind of business districts and things like that. But like you said, where's the, how do you make that?
And if I may, Madam Chair, as the mayor of Rosemont, I've always thought, well, we do our comp guide plans and then send it off and everyone approves them always. But it's like we just don't think long-term. In senior housing, yeah, we got it popping up everywhere, but it's not in a systematic, close proximity. Rosemont does their thing, Apple Valley does theirs. Lakeville, and I think if you had elected across boundaries, hey, long-term, what could we create 30 years from now if we work together?
Well, Darts has short buses in Dakota County, and they take people, you know, go around, pick up seniors and take them for groceries and whatnot. Microtransit is gonna be a bigger and
That's key.
bigger issue
But-
with that.
But you just don't fill them up. Now, you can travel to a destination place and the hotels are there. Yes, the bus comes around every 15 minutes. Why? Because they built the density there. Wow, this is great. You don't even have to plan, just walk out.
And a lot of the continuity of care homes have their own little buses with
Yeah.
a volunteer driver that takes people around to go to do things.
Sure.
But also, Madam Chair, I think a big component of this is who gets elected.
Yeah.
And if only there was some sort of regional body that could plan and manage that.
Great idea.
You got, there has to be city councils that are willing to reach out with,
Yes.
work with each other and
Yes.
be open-minded.
And just, if I may, on that, I was thinking about each county, well, each metro county, or at least Hennepin and Ramsey, I know, have their regional rail authority, you know, that's part of the county structure.
Sure, yeah, yeah.
You know, maybe they need to add more to that and make it a regional transportation authority or whatever, and can help coordinate some of that work between the cities in their county or something like that too, so that it's not all within one city limits.
They got money too this last year.
They did.
A lot of them were planning on using it for trails from what I've been hearing so far. Okay,
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.
so next up is draft land use policies and actions. Angela, moving chairs. You can just stay in the chair that you were in if you want to.
I don't care.
Are you sure? Just grab the microphone so you have your own microphone. And you have all your stuff.
Yeah, I was gonna take all my stuff with me, it should be easier. Just curious if you'd like me to introduce myself? So, this is not something that should be new to you. Oh, I left the clicker. We've been coming and talking through many components of this for the last, since we started talking about community designations, honestly, so it's been over a couple of years now. So I wanted to share some components that have evolved based on feedback not only from you all, but from the community, from residents, from other stakeholders, local governments, and others too. So just to set the stage, I wanted to remind us that we have been talking about this for quite some time. I'll go through a Thrive comparison as to what direction was provided in Thrive and where direction is evolving right now, just to kind of give us some foundation as to the level of change and how terminology even is evolving. We'll look at the draft policies and actions. The staff report included a lot of information, so I do hope they had an opportunity to look at it. There's context in there that isn't on the slides. So just so you know, the PowerPoint is not the language. The PowerPoint is just a summary, and we'll just hit some high points on it. I'm not even gonna read everything that's on the PowerPoints too. So it's a lot of information because we're at that point now where we have a lot of written language that we're actually trying to walk through. And then we'll have a discussion, some discussion questions, and I'll go over some next steps. So this is related to the objective language that you've already seen, and you've seen revised objective language as well. The top line in blue reflects the draft language for 4 of the Imagine 2050 land use objectives. The bottom line in green represents the existing language that's in Thrive. Just a couple of structural changes I can mention is that there isn't a direct comparison, like this equals this equals this equals this from 2040 to 2050. And so, for example, there isn't necessarily an objective that's specifically relating to community well-being and safety in the same way as we're developing that for Imagine 2050. That's just not the same kind of language in Thrive MSP 2040. Another change in Thrive, natural resources, and we're changing that terminology to natural systems. Natural resources was actually kind of broken up into the natural environment and the water components of the natural systems. And so there's 2 objectives, and it looks like we cut that back, but I promise that it's still all there. But we're just framing it as a more ecological approach, and hopefully that's a more holistic approach to natural systems and the work that we're doing there. I should probably move both my notes and the slides. Okay, so this is the second set of comparisons. See housing, equitable development, climate, and economic well-being. One thing that you can see is, again, a change in terminology. In Thrive, there were references to housing options, whereas they're moving to housing opportunities, just as part of the housing planning profession at large, and honestly from feedback that you all shared in this meeting as well. There wasn't also a direct comparison for equitable development in Thrive as there is in Imagine 2050. Equity was in Thrive. It wasn't as prevalent and as much of a regional goal in the same way as we're trying to develop that in Imagine 2050. So those are some of the big picture structural changes, but you can see too that there's a lot of similarities. And I do want to talk about the comparison of themes and policies. So there are some new things. In the next slide, I'll talk about the things that are the same or similar. New themes. We heard from the engagement work that we did with the Native community as well as the non-Native community that they wanted to see a much more pronounced perspective of the Native community built into regional planning. So you'll see Indigenous perspectives reflected. You'll see some proposed actions that would support rebuilding some relationships with the Native community as well, and even some ideas on actual work that we would want to do with the Native community. Similarly, equitable development approaches weren't specifically called out in the land use policies in Thrive, and we're building that in throughout the land use policies. Yes, we have its own objective, but you'll see other objectives also reflecting equity elements as well. And there is a focus on people, residents, and community benefits more so than the public and private investment benefit. And so really looking much more at an individual human scale and really trying to integrate that into regional policy as well. We've got some new approaches. A lot of these we've talked about as possibilities as we're talking through some of the things that Raya brought forward and some of the density approaches. A lot of that has been new in the conversation. We did hear from a lot of our rural and agricultural communities concerns about solar developments, and so really trying to call out where we think we would like to encourage solar development and where it might make sense to preserve prime farmland, for example. There is a lot of underutilized and vacant areas where there might be possibilities to co-locate solar uses with another use and looking at how we can encourage and incentivize some of that. Supporting urban agricultural uses, it was in Thrive, it wasn't very obvious, it was in some paragraph here or a mention there, and we want to make sure that with all agricultural uses, we're also supporting urban agricultural uses too.
I have a question about that.
Sure.
To some I mean, if you're doing something like the people that grow tomatoes by Faribault, they're doing their agriculture pretty compactly. But if it's taking up lots that could be family dwellings in the core, I kind of see two sides to that. Putting it in parks, in extra space, but not taking up lots that could be developed, because that kind of goes against our whole density and using the infrastructure that we have thing. There's a conflict there.
I think that it's actually complementary. So I think that what you're saying is what we would be encouraging on underutilized or vacant areas where communities identify that community gardens might be a good thing to develop. We would encourage that. And so this wouldn't be in place of development, like a big huge community garden on a fully able to be developed, ready to go kind of property. We would just be encouraging urban ag to be supported by local governments.
Madam Chair, if I may.
Bill?
Thank you. And so I was just kind of curious on the indigenous perspective. I've always assumed that we were already trying to match some of the aspects that they were wanting to do, overall, as far as in our planning. So this is, I guess, is this something new that is being brought forward, or I guess, or what's going on? I don't understand this.
Chair and committee members, I think that we have always had good intentions, and I don't think that they've been fully realized. And the Native community has been harmed by a lot of action by government, and so there's a lot of relationship rebuilding that we need to really work on repairing, and saying those things very explicitly and saying those things very intentionally is important to the Native community. And so I think that we're trying to emphasize it, to highlight that we have heard you. We know you're still here. We want to work on repairing some of the things that we have really not done well in the past. We want to do that with your leadership and partnership, and we can always do better. Even just trying to fix some of the things in the past, we can always do better going forward, and we just want to be more explicit about that.
Basically, just recognizing this is basically what we're doing. Okay, that's fine. And then also the other thing, I had equitable development. Are we not doing that already currently?
Chair and committee members, we are doing it. It was in Thrive. We need to provide more tools and resources to local governments on what that might mean, whether that is explicit training, opportunities, whether those are just the equitable development scorecards and things like that, and how we can help local governments implement that in their planning a little bit more explicitly. I think it is an approach that we're trying to highlight, and we just didn't do that in the same overt way in Thrive. But you're right, we have been trying to do that. I think we can do better.
Okay.
Ready to go on?
Madam Chair, I was gonna actually touch on the solar development piece of it. Because you touch on farms, but what really doesn't get talked about is buildings. like tops of buildings, encouraging that solar rather than taking land. And I'm wondering if that is being brought into this mix too.
Chair and committee member, yes, absolutely. That is one of the things when we're talking about underutilized area, we're talking about co-locating those areas. We see a lot of paid parking areas. Solar would be great on top of any kind of structure. And we have done a lot of solar analysis where we do have tools that we can help roll out to local governments where they can identify the solar potential in their community, where that might make most sense and where it certainly doesn't make sense. And we're trying to provide that balance of really encouraging preservation of those prime ag areas and encouraging solar development, which is really important for climate change and other energy efficiencies. We want to make sure that we're doing the kind of encouraging and supporting of the right kinds of uses and the right kinds of places. Thank you.
And that's a good point, you know, putting it on top of the user where you can, is, you don't have the line loss that you have if it's
Oh, yeah.
in Jordan or someplace and
Yeah.
going a long way to.
Well, there's actually one big area in, actually in Jerry's region that there's this huge solar farm and it's all developing around it. It's just there.
Yeah.
So,
It probably wasn't intended or thought that it would be developed or.
right, exactly.
When it was done, yeah.
Well, and it creates a whole island where there's no
Yes.
connection to get
Yeah.
through it,
Yes.
Right.
yeah. Did you have something to say?
But I was just gonna, a little bit of feedback on the urban agriculture side of it too. I think that the opportunity there is to look at trade-offs rather than saying, you know, we are gonna preclude this much space that could be single-family lots because we wanna have the urban agriculture there. I think that you look at, all right, maybe we trade off some more density surrounding that area to maintain sort of the average density, but still preserving or providing that opportunity for that urban agriculture. I know we've got an example just across the border from us in Maplewood, where the St. Paul Water Authority has a giant property and they haven't used most of it. They've just kind of reserved it for potential future water storage capacity back when they first, you know, moved into Maplewood when there wasn't anything else there. And now they're talking about developing the property. Well, in the meantime, they had provided an opportunity for community members to do a pretty good sized community garden. There's a lot of people that are new immigrants and things like that, so it's very, very well received and very well used. Now they're starting to talk about doing development of the property, and so the tension there is, you know, the gardeners want to maintain the gardens, the water authority and developing community people want, you know, housing. So how do you make that work? And so I think that's an example of where you can try to find those trade-offs, and they're looking at trying to ring more density around the gardens, but still provide that opportunity for the gardens. So.
Okay. Are we ready to move on? Okay.
So in addition to the new themes, new approaches, we have talked to here about some re-emerging thoughts. One being like a 20-year rolling land supply. We've talked about the availability of land already within the MUSA, 35 years worth of land supply within the existing MUSA. And then looking at how, when we're adding to the MUSA, what that rolling land supply looks like. Do we need more land within that area? And looking at, and we used to have rolling land supply policies a couple plans back. And so it has been done before. I'll have to defer to Lisa if you need history on it, because I don't have it. Because I don't have it. But I know that it has been done at the council before. We're looking as to whether or not it's appropriate now, what that might mean for policy now, and thinking about how that could come back into play. We've talked about.
Can I ask you a question? Is that back when they used to bring things into the MUSA one plat at a time, or are you thinking of something different from that?
I
Because one
believe
plat
so.
at a time was terrible.
They still do that though.
They're
Still doing one plat at a time.
Thank you, Madam Chair, committee members. Lisa Barajas, Executive Director of Community Development Division. I happen to be a great receiver of all sorts of typewritten documents from my predecessors in this role, which is, and I happen to read them, which is how I know a lot of these things, not because I was here at that time, but there was a lot of interim MUSA policy coming in from the mid-90s and into the 2000s as development was picking up after the recession. The council didn't have, this is the one plat era, and everything was really just kind of contentious about bringing each of those in. And it is one of the reasons one of the conditions that led to the council ultimately developing the plant monitoring program was to, as part of it, keeping track of rolling land supply and also how things were going. But in that process, rolling land supply early on was used really to review requests, especially for large additions to the regional system, looking at what was already planned within the MUSA, how much land was available both within that community, what was projected for growth for that community, as well as what was planned for the entire region, and how much land and projected growth we had remaining within that time horizon. And kind of using that land capacity analysis to say, how much further would this get us? Do we need another decade, 2 or 3 more decades of growth? There was one particular memo that I had come across that I can't remember which city it was, doesn't really matter, but their request for several hundred acres worth of land to be added at their rate of growth that they historically have had would have given them something like 47 more years of land supply. Or like, yeah, that puts a strain on the regional system to have to commit to that when you don't need that. So that's what we're thinking of as part of this, is when we're starting to, anticipating at some point that growth is going to pick up again around those developing edges, and being prepared for what that would look like, and whether whether we even have criteria to be prepared for those types of requests today, which we don't currently have in place.
Okay, yeah, because when I was first on the planning commission in 1996, each plat would be added to the MUSA one at a time. And Lakeville was the first to pilot the phased MUSA, and then everybody started doing it because it works better. I do not advocate going back to that. That was terrible.
And if I may, Madam Chair, what is within local comprehensive plans today, that staging of growth is what helps us avoid having to do that. And so really just building off of that, not for the plan development that we already have, but thinking forward to those requests that usually come in through amendments or come in outside of the planning, or even during the planning process, when sometimes we have new communities saying, hey, well, we want to get on MUSA too. And gives us that built-in policy, well, these are the conditions under which the council would consider bringing a new community into the MUSA.
Well, the way that the comp plan process goes, we take up all of the first 10 years with talking about things. The second 10 years, the plan actually is in effect. And then there's another 10 years after that that will be actually covered by the next plan. So we have 10 years of fluff, in terms of if you phase things, you could, change the phasing a little bit if there was a big demand.
Yeah, for phasing within communities, absolutely. I think that's where especially having that flexibility that we currently have within the MUSA, that 35 years of land supply, that's within the already planned areas at the densities they're planned at today. So when we're looking at additional things, like, do we really need this, or are you going to make adjustments around what you're planning for? Partly so that we aren't overbuilding the system, but we're building the system that we need to support development where it's going to go.
Madam Chair?
Yes.
Yeah, thank you. I guess my question is how far out can we go as far as expansion for MUSA? I mean, how much capacity can Pig's Eye plant handle? How much is too much? We're looking at maybe expanding the MUSA line or the MUSA system, but yet if we're continuing to want to condense and consolidate and focus more in more urban development, more housing and so forth, that's going to increase the amount of waste that's going through that system. Like you had mentioned earlier, your system's almost full. I mean,
That's just one pipe, not the.
that's one. Well, eventually all these pipes are going to get full. What's going to happen? I mean, how far can we go with this thing before we have to build another plant?
Well, and sometimes we do put in another plant. We have plans to redirect some of the flow that's going to St. Paul, have it instead go west.
To Rogers.
Yeah, so there's always tinkering around the edges. And we have a very long-term plan beyond 2050 of what needs to happen. The map for our wastewater system shows what's planned through 2040, And then there's lighter colors for each plant that go farther out than that. And not for any particular time, because that is a moving target. But
Yeah,
there's a lot more than what we need through 2050.
thank you.
You're welcome.
That's all I have to say.
Thank you for that insight, I appreciate it. So just so that we're talking about growth, density, and natural systems, these are all things that are the same or similar from what was in Thrive. I don't think you'll be too surprised with any of these things. Maximizing investment, infrastructure investment, promoting compact development, that was in Thrive as well. Directing growth where infrastructure already exists. Those are the same kinds of conversations that were in Thrive as they are now. Sometimes when we're talking about density, the implementation of that policy might be a little bit different. We've been talking about some of those approaches here, but the actual policy establishing minimum densities by community designation, that's been done, maybe different names for community designations over time, but that's carried forward as well. Rural service areas have maximum densities. Areas within the MUSA have minimum densities. That's the same kind of structure that we're talking about there as well. For natural systems, I don't think that it would be any surprise. We've always tried to direct growth away from sensitive ecosystems. I think that we're trying to protect natural systems in Thrive a little bit more at the development scale this next time, but we've always tried to protect natural systems as best we can. You'll see groundwater prevention, contamination from development, regional guidelines for priority waters protection, local water supply plans. All of those are things that have been done and will continue to move forward. So with that, and if we only get through this one objective, it'll be the same as any other conversation I've had this week. So don't feel bad. At this point, that's my goal.
So
Yeah, at that point, at this point, that's my goal. We did get through the objectives a lot faster than we did in other conversations, but I just wanted to remind you, we do have 8 objectives. We have reviewed those several times here. You'll see that language does continue to evolve, and we'll keep doing that as we have more engagement, as we continue to talk with you and other committees and other groups, and as the public comment periods start to open, we're going to do a 60% draft of the regional plan distribution in early June, I believe. So that's before the required public comment period. So you'll see kind of iterations of this evolving all throughout the year. This is where we're at today. And we're going to talk about the first one to start, the policies and actions under the objective for respect the relationship with land and water as a foundation for regional growth. Oh, that looks very different on my screen than it does on these screens, so I apologize if the colors are a little jarring. So the first objective, respect the relationship with land and water as a foundation for regional growth, has 5 policies. The first 2 are on this slide. You can see the incorporation of indigenous approaches as policy 1, where we can adopt regional land management guidelines in areas where the council either owns or has influence over the land, and then share out best practices with local governments, provide technical assistance on what Native communities would advise in preservation of open spaces and how to care for the land. I think that to do that, we can work with a Native partnership council of some sort, establishing that for the council. The council is working with many Native organizations and individuals right now to to craft and then adopt eventually a land and water acknowledgement, and so that would be tied with actions, and we would probably build in more of those actions throughout the policy plans as that work emerges. The second policy is really related to accommodating regional growth. This is a lot of the regulatory stuff that we've been really digging into. And just to emphasize the iterative process of this, I realize that the language here is not quite correct. We're not minimizing the amount of land anymore, but
Good,
we-
I was gonna
but
jump all
we're-
over you.
I
for
know,
that.
that's why I mentioned it. But we are going to use land efficiently in some way, and so thinking about things in response to feedback that we do receive. So that's the iterative process. But policy 2 really talks about promoting compact development. Here's the 20-year land supply as well. New connections to the regional system, meeting the community designations minimum density, which was one of the approaches that we talked about when Raya was here presenting. Requests for MUSA expansion, as we've been mentioning. Again, maximizing infrastructure investments, which you saw in the Thrive language. We have talked too about approaches for how local governments are identifying land that they are planning for growth and doing that by decade rather than the entire planning horizon. That in itself will, I think, address a lot of the density issues that we were talking about. And of course, some of those density approaches and policies are best done in layers. So with flexibility and other programs built in on top of that as well. Setting density expectations by community designation and encouraging orderly annexation agreements. In the staff report, you'll see a lot more context around some of these things, so please feel free to dig into the staff report if you didn't already, and I'm happy to receive comments from you anytime, so you have my contact information if you didn't get an opportunity to do that. I'll go through the next 3 policies real quick, and then we'll talk about the policies as a bunch, and whichever order you like. Policy 3 really talks about minimizing urbanization of rural and ag areas, really trying to protect ag areas and provide urban services based on regional system plans and long-term needs. That policy talks about encouraging participation in the Ag Preserves program, even working at the legislature to promote changes that, thank you very much. Thank you, Chair, and
It was Sandy.
and staff as well, thank you. Really talking about how we can support even at the legislature, strengthening the Ag Preserves program. Again, preserving prime ag soils, discouraging or encouraging solar development, depending on where that might be, and other kind of urban ag and agriculturally focused policies. Policy 4 talks about maximizing the use of the existing built environment, focusing on redevelopment, infill, adaptive reuse. We may even want to explore setting up a redevelopment monitoring program. Redevelopment is very hard to track, so it might mean that we look at our existing annual building permit survey and think about what questions might prompt answers that help us get a better idea of where and when and how redevelopment is happening. And looking then, of course, to encourage adaptive reuse of vacant or historic buildings. And you'll see community purposes and community benefit mentioned in a lot of places. Community connection has been one of the prime topics of feedback that we've received from residents and community organization, particularly post-COVID, really trying to rebuild that community fabric. 5th policy, really looking at directing growth away from sensitive ecosystems and prioritizing the protection of natural systems. And this is where you'll see those policies around groundwater contamination, considering water supply constraints when accommodating growth, protecting water from development, restoring water quality is a part of development, and the reflection of drinking water availability to where we're accommodating growth in local plans. As I look at that last one, it reminds me to mention that part of the work that we need to do and build out so that it's more clear for the reader is which of these are council roles and which of these are local roles. A lot of the places where you're seeing encourage, those are things then that would obviously live in the local realm, and the council's role would be to encourage and provide technical assistance around whatever topic that might be. There are things though that are council roles, setting and directing density requirements and setting those community designations, for example. Those are things then the council role would be. But I'm happy to pause here and think about any questions that you might have as it relates to this objective and these 5 policies with the accompanying actions that are hoping to implement those policies.
So questions or comments?
Well, I have one, Madam Chair. I was looking at the redevelopment, and I know in Shakopee, that's probably the thing from businesses that we hear the most, is when that redevelopment happens, that they feel like they're hamstrung by Met Council's idea of what a SAC credit is. And so for what we're seeing is when the redevelopment happens, there's always more and more that is added as a SAC credit. And so we're just trying to kind of figure out what's the best balance on what is required of Met Council and what we want to do to develop that area or redevelop that area. So it's kind of this push and pull a little bit.
Is that before we made changes to SAC or after? Because several years ago, we changed it, like with restaurants was the one that was the biggest tension. You get credit for the size of your building. As long as you don't expand your building, there is no more SAC. You can move walls, add tables, change where your kitchen is, whatever you want to do inside the building. And it's only if you add on to the building that there was any change in SAC.
Well, that's not what we're hearing from the redevelopment though. That we're
Okay.
hearing that they're still having to add, and I know that some of the, use might change a little bit, but I don't think it changes to the point where there should be that many additional SAC credits to those.
It depends on if you're going from like a retail store to a coffee shop or a restaurant or something, then there's going to be a change.
Right, absolutely.
But if you're staying the same roughly use and not expanding the building, there should be no additional SAC. So if people are having trouble with that, have them contact me and I will work on it because we
Okay.
cleared those things up
Yeah.
before.
Yeah, because I was just at the chamber meeting in January and that was a huge topic of
Yeah,
conversation.
because actually our calls and complaints about SAC have gone down dramatically since we fixed that several years ago. It's made things a lot easier, but sometimes the cities don't get fully up to date on.
Well, and I think that's part of it is that it's that feeling from the business community, and then that's just amplified by maybe not being educated on what's happening. And for us, I think that's the biggest part of it, sitting on the utility side of it, is that they're seeing that as a way as a barrier to that development or redevelopment of the area.
Yeah, so if you have particular people that are going through that, let me know.
Okay.
If the chamber wants somebody to come out and talk about the changes, we would be happy to do that as
That might
well,
be
to
a
get
great
the
idea. Maybe I'll connect you with
information
our,
out there.
Yeah.
But yeah, it's much better because we didn't want to be the chair police.
right.
Measuring the bar to see how many stools you could fit on it and stuff. That was miserable. Nobody enjoyed that. So and every once in a while, there's something weird that pops out because anytime you switch to a new system, you're always going to find something that didn't turn out the way that you intended it to. But for the most part, it's been working much better lately. So,
It's good to hear.
Dave,
And
Dan.
just on that, I think sometimes this is an example of where the policy changed and was improved at the council, but the
But
last
nobody
people to
knows.
hear about it are the developers and businesses who are
Yes.
only impacted when they start to try to make a change. So that's where
Yeah.
I think that education makes a lot of sense. And I know in our community, we have a ton of SAC credits that the city has that we've been using as a development incentive tool
Yeah.
or, development facilitation tool. So when there are those use changes, we can still help people by applying some of those credits. So that's,
Well, and
there's lots of ways in the system
Yeah.
to make it work.
Yeah, and as a utility, we decided to put dollars towards that economic development as well, because we were starting to run out. And so we felt like that, we didn't want to pick winners and losers as a utility, but we pushed that all on the council as say, you use those credits as you need if
I
we need
wonder
to
if
get
our
developed.
credits are lucrative to try to sell to other communities.
That has been done in the past. You're one of the few that has any left.
Right, I was gonna say, you're probably lucky.
Well, and I think we've got
So
a
the
ton.
prices Rise.
Every once in a while, the tribe sells some off too. I think you and SMSC or maybe just a handful of places that have any credits left, so.
Note that for us.
There you go, Dan. That'll be a selling point for redevelopment.
By the way,
Anybody else?
thank you.
You just love policy 1 or policy 2, whatever, I mean.
Just because we've talked about it before, I just wanted to know for, like, are new approaches to policies going in the right direction? Are there any remaining concerns about some of the things that we have talked about for some of those new approaches? Are there some things that we shouldn't carry forward, thinking about it in that scope? Or, just checking before we move on.
Dan?
In terms of the redevelopment monitoring, I think that does make a lot of sense, because that's what urban and first ring suburbs are seeing a lot more of is redevelopment. And a lot of times that's where change is actually happening and where we're meeting some of our comp plan objectives and things like that is actually through that redevelopment, which may not be well understood necessarily in the system unless we've got some good tools in place to do that.
Bill?
Just on the short-term side, I was at Egan's State of the City, but when you talk redevelopment, especially on the commercial office building, we're all gonna see that. As you try to figure out reposition buildings, who knows what, and it comes to that SAC and
Good point.
et cetera.
Anything else?
But I'd say good.
My only remaining concern was that obviously you want to encourage redevelopment, but we don't want to go too far to discourage new development that's not available in those other parts.
Right. It's a balance.
Yeah, exactly. And it just occurred to me that we've actually, with livable communities, kind of gone away from supporting the preservation of historic buildings and stuff, because we did a lot with Hastings on their confluence, where it was an old factory that they turned into a gathering place and restaurant and apartments and hotel. And that's not something that we would probably fund anymore. So that's something maybe to think about.
Mhm.
Moving on.
Thank
Hey,
you.
we're
We've
being
made
exceptional today.
We made progress. I'm just I don't even know what to do now. Okay, no. For objective 3, so I should mention I brought forward objective 1 because we've had extensive conversations about it, so I felt like we could review and recap. And I brought forward objectives 3 and 6 because there's no direct equivalency in Thrive. So they're kind of like fresh slate, although we may be bringing in things from other sections of plans that we have encouraged, things like complete streets and other things in Thrive. It just wasn't a direct relationship. And so that's why this is objective 3, establish vibrant, inclusive, connected and safe communities for people to live in. This objective has 7 policies. The first 3 on this slide and the next 4 on the next slide. So the first policy, prioritize planning practices that support mixed-use development, walkable neighborhoods, and easy access to public transportation. Some of the things that are embedded within that policy are related to, again, the human scale experience, parking requirements, form-based codes, design aspects like complete streets and some of the other environmental design components that are emerging. The second policy, plan and maintain public spaces for community gatherings. This gets to that social connection that I mentioned earlier. A lot of placemaking initiatives, free and accessible public gathering spaces was one of actually the biggest things that we heard about from our residents, the residents engagement that we have done. And those public spaces having access to things like water and restrooms and transit and parking. As well as culturally significant design elements that really create a welcoming environment for all members of the community and not necessarily areas where someone may or may not feel comfortable or welcomed. Public art installations can help with that as well, and so some of those actions are embedded into this policy.
What does culturally significant design elements mean?
Even signage that's in another language can help. Sorry, Chair.
We're not that formal
Sorry.
here, it's okay.
Well, I'm supposed to. And so sometimes even it is that design element where you're identifying things in a language that is familiar to someone. You see that culturally significant design elements in Bide Makanska. And so name changes matter as well. There are lots of things that are encompassed in that. Where I know that these are maybe more urban examples, but they can be in any area. When you're doing a public area like light rail transit stations or bus stops, you can have urban or art areas that reflect the community that is living in that area, in that neighborhood. And you see that in the light rail stations as you go through University, if you've been down that area at all. So there are things like that that can be integrated and encouraged for local governments to consider as they're doing local planning and design.
Okay.
Where was I? Policy 3, prioritize and plan for creation and preservation of green public spaces in urban areas. Not necessarily urban areas, so that's an area where we can improve language, but in developing
Developed
areas.
yeah.
Yep. So again, neighborhood scale public open spaces, using underutilized areas or underutilized buildings for green infrastructure. That can be community gardens or it can be any kind of other green infrastructure. Preservation, integration of green spaces in development and community-based urban ag initiatives show up in this policy area. The next policies that live within this object are live within this objective. Yeah, I was right. Center community engagement in the planning process to build community trust and ownership.
We need to advance the slide.
Oh, I do. Thank you. Oh, I advanced it twice on my laptop. That was the problem. Thank you. Maybe I should give this to you.
Yeah, maybe I should. Tell me when to go.
Let the chair drive.
Thank you.
I'll give it to you, you're better at it.
So part of the council's equity framework talks about 3 different things. Contextualize, so reflecting in the neighborhood, understanding the context of the neighborhood and the community that you're in. Community-centered and really talking with community about what community wants in community areas, and reparative. And so thinking about how during the course of development can we repair some of those natural areas that were, taken out, or trees that were, can we replace trees, those kinds of things. That's an example of a reparative action. It can also be much broader in the scope of things like the Rondo neighborhood and rebuilding some of that, addressing some of the environmental concerns in Pig's Eye area, since you mentioned that earlier. That's top of mind now. So water quality improvement, those are all reparative actions, so thinking about that. And for this one, it really focuses on that center piece of community-centered engagement, how we're talking with community as we are doing planning work. So utilizing public and private partnerships to implement projects, to enhance context-sensitive design and foster community identity. That can go part and parcel with those art installations, that design elements that were culturally inclusive, but also supporting the long-term affordability and stability of gentrifying neighborhoods. Change happens in any neighborhood, and how can we reduce displacement as much as possible, and making sure that we're considering that as change, as we're planning for change. We're certainly planning for 2050, there's gonna be a lot of change over the scope of those years, and we can really think about where communities will be moving and displaced, willingly or unwillingly, and we wanna make sure that we're considering that in the planning process. With that goes policy 5 for protecting historic and cultural assets, and this is, again, where we're thinking about expansive culturally historic preservation practices. So I don't think it'll be a surprise to any of you that the 7-county region is a majority white population. There's lots of other populations that live here now though. So when we're thinking about historic preservation, that's not just the really important Catholic Church, those historic buildings, but it's also other spaces that reflect the history that has happened here and maybe no longer shows up. The Native community, for example. Sorry, I should clarify. The Native community is still here. Some of the aspects of their cultural of their culture may not be as visible, and we can increase that visibility. Policy 6 talks about, again, inclusive design principles that consider the needs of all community members, and developments really focusing on going beyond the minimum ADA requirements and meeting the full needs of the disabled community. Collaborating with educational institutions, safe routes to school, for example, really making sure that there's partnership between the community members and as development happens and how we can get children safely to their educational institutions. Integrate sustainable water management strategies into the design of public spaces, water conservation practices such as water reuse, low impact development practices when designing public spaces, and things like that will show up under this policy as well. So with that, I'll pause again to ask the questions. Are the new approaches to policy going in the right direction? Are there concerns about existing approaches or a lack of new approaches in any of the areas? Are there current approaches that shouldn't be carried forward? And any other questions that might rise to the top of mind, I'm happy to hear as well. What do these things trigger for you?
Who wants to go first?
Madam
Oh,
Chair,
go
if I
ahead.
may. For policy 4, so obviously community engagement is very important. I can think of a handful of proposals or projects that actually came to fruition where if you ask the developer and the city and kind of the people running with it, if they did community engagement, the answer is a resounding yes. And then if you read the news and, kind of hear sound bites from community members, once the project gets the go-ahead, it's like, we didn't know this was happening, nobody told us. Is there any intentional, kind of teeth, for lack of a better term, written into that policy, in the details of it, that can help cities say, here are the markers you need to hit, and once those are hit, community members there's just, that's kind of the point where the project's going forward, and because we've done X, Y, Z for outreach, I guess, there just seems to always be a disconnect, and maybe it's just the loud voice effect or whatever, but I'm just curious about that.
Chair and committee members, I don't know about teeth as far as encouraging local governments and how they do their project work, although we'll definitely provide technical assistance and answer questions, and we have in the past provided various trainings and workshops where we're talking about new and innovative community engagement practices, and we'll continue to do that work. We can certainly do the council's work differently, and the equity framework really talks about how we should be doing that differently. In fact, we will be bringing to the committee of the whole, newsflash, sorry, to the committee of the whole in April, the first meeting in April.
Hopefully it wasn't a secret.
No, it wasn't. I just don't know if you knew about it.
No, they don't tell me anything.
I find that hard to at the beginning of April, April 3rd, I think, committee of the whole meeting will be bringing forward an update on all of the equity chapter components, and several of those, not only the equity framework and environmental justice framework, a community-centered engagement framework is part of that as well. We've been working with our communications staff on that. The council currently has a public participation plan. It's a lot of P's in that. Public participation plan, and we'll be obviously updating and replacing some of the incentives or some of the expectations in that plan as part of this. So I think that we start by showing our work and showing up differently and really prioritizing who we are talking with. Communities that have been historically underrepresented and have historically not had a voice are the focus of some of that work. That doesn't mean that we don't still work with our traditional stakeholders, but our traditional stakeholders certainly know how to get a hold of us, and they certainly already know how to navigate government structures. Some of what we're proposing to do with that is to build community capacity, and so the council has an obligation to work with community organizations so that they can be more successful in engaging with projects that are in their neighborhoods and communities. So there's a lot of ideas and a lot of hopeful change that we can set as expectations for council projects and council work, and then we'll provide any lessons learned and all of those kinds of tools and resources for local governments as they do their work as well.
And it kind of depends on what is the nature of the change. If it's a rezoning or a plat or something, there's a lot of opportunity for community notification and discussion. If it's getting a subsidy, there's definitely the opportunity for people to advocate for things. But if it's just a building permit, people have the right to do what they want with their property as long as they're obeying the rules. Dan?
So I was thinking about that because I know we've done a lot of work and continue to try to figure out ways to make some of those connections you were most recently talking about, Angela. But I'm imagining that because this is a policy and because you've got some of the goals or the sub-level below that as part of this, that as you're reviewing the next round of comp plans, you would like to see cities provide some kind of evidence that cities have been thoughtful about how to engage in the decision-making that is associated with comp plans and zoning changes and development and all those sorts of things as part of that process. And I don't know that you'll necessarily, not accept a comp plan that doesn't get into that too much, but certainly that might be something that, an opportunity for some back and forth with the city to help and certainly guidance up front to help cities understand what kind of is being looked for there. But some of the tools that we've done differently, instead of only having a public hearing at the last step of the approval process, now we require developers to do a open house as one of the requirements for a complete application for a land use application at the city. So they would have theoretically already done a lot of engagement with people before it ever gets to the point of starting the planning commission and staff and council process. So those, and it's not perfect, I don't want to advertise this as like this is the greatest solution ever, but it has helped with the number of people that show up at that last council meeting and say, oh, I've never heard of this, that kind of thing. I think the challenge we still face is the developer sort of checks the box that they've done it, but I don't know that they've really heard what people said in that open house. And so we're trying to work on tools to get people to actually, the developer to actually express, here's what we heard from the neighborhood or whatever, and here's what we're doing differently as a result of it, or here's what we can't do differently as a result of it and why. So anyway, we're still evolving through that, but I think I get that you're kind of going to be looking for that in the next round of comp plans as to what communities are doing.
Well, we've already been doing that with park funding. If you want to get your long-term plan approved for a regional park, you have to have that community outreach and go beyond just, hey, we came up with this plan, what do you think? Is talk to people on the front end, what things would you like to do in the park? How can we accommodate everybody's needs? And they've been coming up with better plans as a result.
Yeah. And then I just want to note on policy 5, I did note in the language in the handout, it says local governments must identify historic and cultural assets within their community, and local governments must develop policies. So when I see the word must, I believe that is something where that council is requiring something of local
I
communities.
think it's in state law.
Yeah,
That's
okay.
such,
Yeah, okay.
So
You'll
it's
see
not
the
a,
strongest language
Yeah.
when it's reflected in statute, yeah.
But in this policy, we're actually bringing it to the forefront so that nobody forgets that it's the law.
Yeah.
Okay, got it.
And to, bless you, Chair, if I may.
thank you.
And two, I would add, you're just talking about asking for community engagement, kind of show your work before the comp plans as the comp plans are received, and that we don't have any idea yet of what those requirements would be. But you're right, we probably wouldn't say, sorry, that's not good enough, because we don't have the same kind of authority around that. Those are the softer kinds of things around the edges. But where I see incentives is in exactly that kind of thing. We have a planning assistance grant fund. We do issue planning grants, and I have a lot of grant ideas, and I've been sharing them broadly and widely. But this could be an equity initiative that local governments could then potentially get additional funds in order to do better and more robust community engagement with underrepresented communities, for example. So we haven't obviously developed that part of the program yet either, but these are all kinds of ideas where we can do kind of promote that kind, encourage that kind of change.
And just a quick follow-up, I think the nice thing about it is putting it as a policy, having it in what's gonna go out to all the cities as they start to put together the comp plans. It's one of those things that cities have to be responsive to, or feel that they have to be responsive to in developing their next comp plan. So it gets it on the radar for a lot of communities that just may not have been thinking in those terms yet. So that makes it a good thing just there.
Thank you for that feedback, I appreciate it.
Anything else? Boy,
We
we're
are-
really overachievers today.
We are making great progress. Okay.
Do you have more backup beyond 1, 3,
You
and 6?
have so much detail. Good job.
I'm trying to provide as much as we have developed, and so I know people want to see the language. So what are you actually going to write in the policy plan? We're trying to provide that as much as we can as these things are evolving. So Sandy, next slide, please. Thank you. Remedy past and present discriminatory land use practices. This is objective 6. Obviously, this is our equity objective. It has 4 policies. First is, I think, one of the first steps into equity work, and we're just taking ownership of past harms, providing transparent communication, and holding governments accountable to plans and actions. Just because our agency, or just because me, myself, and I in this moment hasn't participated in inequitable policies or practices doesn't mean that my agency hasn't in a long time ago. Other governments haven't a long time ago, and we have a responsibility in my mind to acknowledge where we have been and how we can do better. So again, here you'll see language around equitable land use technical assistance, sharing, which I've mentioned too with the community engagement as well, sharing progress towards equity goals. And as I mentioned before, it's not always clear which is a council role, which is a city role. As we're sharing progress toward equity goals, that would be a council role of responsibility to meet our equity goals. And we could encourage local governments to also provide that, but it wouldn't be a requirement. We can develop decision-making tools as we're developing capital projects, acknowledging disparities and identifying strategies to address them, not just that they're there, but to actually work to address them. Partner with projects like Just Deeds, evaluate council programs, policies, and procedures for better, more equitable outcomes. Policy 2 is prioritizing engagement, collaborating with underrepresented populations to develop plans, policies, and programs responsive to and reflective of community needs. This again gets at that community-centered engagement and really working to co-create where it makes sense with community on the things that the council is doing. Expand representation on committees, not just more committee members, but making sure that those committee members are representative of the communities that where they live. Building new partnerships, focusing on trust. A lot of relationships, even with local governments, with tribal nations, with urban Indian organizations and other community organizations have really, through the years, been battle tested and battle worn. And so with local governments, we know that those relationships need constant care, and so we want to make sure we're doing that. Also focusing on rebuilding relationships where those relationships have been difficult in the past. Or we have been maybe difficult in the past, I don't know, however you can see that, but building community capacity to engage successfully with governments. I mentioned this before when I was talking about equity initiatives as well. Identifying and eliminating barriers, conducting culturally responsive and inclusive engagement, having interpreters available when necessary, for example. Reimburse community members for their time and expertise. In some respects, we're still limited by law in that, for example, the Equity Advisory Committee, we are legally prohibited from compensating members, except for parking, for their time on committees. We can work with the legislature to see if that can change, but anytime we're engaging community members for engagement specifically, we can still reimburse, we can still compensate them for their time and expertise. Next slide, please. Thank you. I'm so much better at saying next slide than actually remembering to do it. Promote equitable distribution of public investments to benefit communities disproportionately harmed by past and present planning practices, and to eliminate racial disparities and discrimination. We're really working to restore community connections negatively impacted by past decisions. Establishing a reparative actions fund to finance mitigation can help with that. Applying the anti-displacement framework that I mentioned that we're going to bring forward at the next committee of the whole meeting, creating tools to identify how projects benefit or harm different communities. So again, developing technical assistance and tools that help with decision making. And again, centering the Native experience in decision making and implementing the actions included in the Council's acknowledgement statement that all land in this region is Dakota land. Engaging in tribal consultation. Our tribal policy at the Council currently just focuses on tribal consultation with the 11 federally recognized tribal nations in Minnesota. And there are many more communities than just those 11 recognized communities. And there are many residents within the region from all over. And they are still residents, and we just because they're not part of a Minnesota recognized tribe, that doesn't mean that we shouldn't work and engage with them. And so updating the Council's procedures for that as well. And happy to take any questions.
Madam Chair?
Bill?
I have one on some policy too. It just says identify and eliminate barriers to engagement. I guess I'm just kind of questioning, how do we get the groups to actually come to meetings and to get them involved and actually participate in decision making or even policy making? I know on this committee we've had various individuals who represented different racial, ethnic backgrounds and so forth, and unfortunately they're not here to represent themselves. How do we make that happen?
Do you want me to respond or would you like?
Go ahead.
Okay. Some of the barriers that we know are time, location, and duration of meetings, where we are, when we're holding them. Most people might be at work during the day, so let's not hold meetings during the day. Let's have access to childcare. If we're holding meetings in the evening, let's provide meals so that people feel as though we're coming into a space where, you know, it's familial. And so there are things like, and obviously compensating people for their time and expense of being there. So there are things like that that we can overcome, that we can at least address some of those barriers just in how we're planning the activities. But there's a lot of other barriers to just, you know, busy life. You know, my kids are at this age and just it's not gonna work. And so we can't force people, but we can eliminate as many of those stumbling blocks and barriers as we possibly can. So part of that is identifying what they are and then identifying how we can work through some of those things.
Anybody else?
Yeah,
Bill?
just if I may, Madam Chair, we have a tendency as government to expect people to come to us on our turf. You need to go out on their turf and engage, and sometimes that's hard to do and it takes a ton of work. But over and over and over, once you're on someone else's property and understand their issue, you'll get a different response.
I think much of this applies to the rural parts of our region as well. They don't trust us. They don't feel like we care about them.
Yep.
And trying to get them to answer a question is very, very difficult. And we need to take the same tactics of understanding people who, because like when you said, oh, governments know how to interact with us, when you have 0 full-time employees in your community,
Yeah.
they don't know how to interact with us at all.
I was just gonna say, if somebody knew the answer to your question, Phil, that they would be, you know, that would be like the magic wand, because I mean, I think we've all been struggling to try to figure that out. I think, you know, in this area, one aspect, you know, in addition to sort of physical barriers or time barriers, I think there's also the ability to help people understand that they have a stake in the decision.
Yeah.
And that's why it's important to participate, because I think a lot of people just figure, you know, it's done by people, it's, you know, it's not something that I have a stake in. And that's probably one of the hardest barriers to overcome. But definitely, you know, and that's where some of the suspicions among rural communities about the Met Council and other parts of, you know, even urban areas or suburban areas have some thoughts about the Met Council just based on, you know, prior information or misinformation or whatever, you know, and so I think, you know, just some of the things we've talked about today about, you know, preserving prime agricultural land and making sure we're not having development to, you know, infringe upon some of those agricultural areas. I'm sure many members or many people in those rural communities probably don't even realize that we're talking in those terms. And I don't know for sure that that's something they'd like to hear, but certainly the fact that they probably don't even know the Met Council is thinking along those lines, that's a big part of the barrier.
Well, we haven't really interacted with them yet on all of this stuff, and there's a tension there between people who want to continue to farm and people who want to sell their land and move to Florida or whatever.
There was Bill's earlier suggestion that we serve wine. Do you want that in the minutes?
That's only if you have it at your
Conversation.
shop.
Oh,
Just kidding.
Chair, if I could, I want to say too that we have done a lot of engagement with our rural communities, with our farmers and producers, more than we have in the past. We know that that's not enough. We have met with all of the townships and all of the rural communities, rural centers, and we continue to do that. And so we know that we can build in more of that. A lot of these things come from what they have shared with us. We've attended a couple of ag-focused conferences, really trying to build out a stronger understanding and presence of that. I know though that the leadership, Lisa and I, both started as rural planners. I grew up in rural Iowa, and so I do feel like in some respects I have a good understanding of some of that. And we know that we need to hear that from them. And so, you know, we can always do more, we can always do better, and we're working to do just that.
Thank you. Madam Chair, I think the one thing that you just touched on, Angela, is what I was going to say. I think we've learned this, you know, as electeds too, is it's the connection. And if we're not making those connections, they're not going to listen to us. And I think it's, you know, we are rural. You know, I did grow up rural. I have that connection with you. Or if it's the minority, is, you know, what is that in your background? And I think that as Met Council, I think you guys are pretty diverse. It's who you send as your messenger. So that's how I see it.
Anything else? Okay, we didn't even go all the way to 6 o'clock.
Oh my goodness, let's talk about next steps. Okay, so Sandy, if you could, since these are the questions that I have been asking at the end of every group of slides, so I won't pause again. But next steps, we have ongoing work at the at the end of Q2 or mid Q2. We're looking at releasing, as I mentioned, a 60% draft plan for public review. trying to get early feedback on draft language so that people that provide feedback know, like, this is not fully baked. You still have an opportunity to really, provide meaningful comments, and we will respond to that. We still need to review the draft language against the equity and environmental justice frameworks. We're still continuing to build out some of the other frameworks. The community-centered engagement one is still in draft form, and so that's why it's going to committee of the whole in a couple of weeks. We'll continue engagement with local governments and community organizations. We have a lot of standing committees. We have a lot of groups that we have set up specifically for the regional planning process. We have a regional planning advisory group with Metro Cities that has been up and running for, I don't know, maybe 2 years now, that we've been working with local community development directors, city administrators, local planners throughout this whole process. So city staff, not elected officials, but city staff that do the planning work. We've been working with them for quite some time. We have reestablished the community designations focus group and built on that. So our first meeting of that local government focus group for land use policy conversations, again, which most local governments care most about the density requirements and some of those regulatory things that we've been talking about. The first meeting was, I think, last week, and we have meetings scheduled through the end of April with that group. We may continue that depending on where the conversations need to go, but that first meeting had about 20 or 25 local representatives, largely different from the participants in the regional planning advisory group, so trying to broaden the reach in many different communities. Also well represented geographically and throughout all of the districts and types of communities. We have a community leaders technical advisory group that is going through that same process now through the end of April, where all of the community organizations where we've had a focus group, where we have had 6-month-long cohorts, we've had several groups of that. We're re-engaging with those community organizations and asking, so the feedback that you gave us early on, the direction that you said, the things that you said that were important to you early on in the process, is that showing up in the policies? How are you seeing your perspectives show up in that work? And so we're doing that work as well. All of these are the land use only initiatives. There's obviously been other things. Phil, committee member, you probably remember the sub-regional watershed engagement workshops that were all throughout the region. We're taking feedback from all of the different policy areas. The transportation folks have done engagement, the environmental services folks, the housing folks, like the regional parks policy folks. We've all done this immense amount of engagement. We're taking all of that in, because obviously land use touches on all of the things, and so we want to make sure that we're continuing to not only engage, but to look back and revise language as we're going. So really wanting to provide balance to the feedback from our underrepresented engagement communities, to weigh out, to try as much as possible to equalize the voice. The underrepresented folks may have only participated in this one planning process right now. And so we want to build the confidence and the capacity within communities to engage with government structures, but we then need to make sure that they're seeing their feedback in the work. And so that's all the important to really balance out areas where there may be tension. We call them dynamic tensions, because two things may very well be wanted, desired at the same time, and yet our capacity to do all things at all times is obviously limited. And so we just want to make sure we're doing our best to balance that out over time. That is all I have for today. We will be back at our next meeting, please come, for the next set of objectives. And so we'll try and get through all of the remaining policies. Remember, I only brought 3 today. And so we'll continue our discussions. I know this committee only meets every other month, and so We may not get through all of the objectives before the the 60% release, but that doesn't mean that you won't have an opportunity to integrate their feedback. I promise that I can make that happen. I will take everything you say to heart and we'll do our best to incorporate that feedback whenever it may happen. It will happen for sure before adoption and before the public hearing period. And so no matter what, we will get through all of the objectives and I just really appreciate the opportunity to come and you guys have provided such good feedback tonight. I'm really pleased with the conversation. We got through all of the objectives. So we'll continue to do this good work, but we'll be back with another set of objectives at the next meeting.
Well, with their,
Can I
Oh, go
ask a
ahead.
question? Is just, I know that we do only meet every other month, but is there more support that you could use for this group in between that?
It would be up to this committee as to whether or not you wanted to meet next month to go through more objectives. It would be in line with the rest of the committees that I'm meeting with and bringing forward objectives on a more regular basis. We would be able to get through more if we met more often, but I wouldn't want to force that.
perhaps Sandy could send out an email to everybody to see if they want to meet next month also, so that we can get through more stuff. Can you do
Sorry,
that?
guys, I put you on the spot.
Well,
I'm in trouble now.
they can say whatever they want.
It's awesome.
They can answer that email whichever way they want, and we'll see how things go.
Will there be treats?
I'll bring treats if people come next
I
month.
was going to say, if I may, maybe we should have one out in the township at Jerry's place.
If he's offering wine, I think Sandy's.
Oh, excuse me, townships, we eliminate them from this plan.
Okay, there being no further work for us to do today, this meeting is adjourned.